helps with research. I actually, background, I'm actually several years in got industry, and then came back to investigators set up data. That's a little bit about my background. As I said, I'm from Mishar. Our mission is to enable and enhance clinical and translation research, and we do that by our main areas. One of the things that we have is a lot of education for investigators, study coordinators. We also have mechanisms to help people get funding for their research. We have groups that actually will help you if you are having trouble recruiting participants or you want to reach out to special communities. We have people that are involved in those communities as well, so we can connect you to the right research participants. And then lastly is support, which is the area that I'm most familiar with. And we have a number of services that we offer to investigators. And the ones I'm going to mostly be focusing on are database development and data management. And just to give you a little bit of background of the kind of work that we do, because I think it may be a little bit different than the kind of studies that you're working on. Dr. Luming said that that you're working different kinds of data than we work with, but I think that the concepts that I'm going to bring forward probably can be applied. It's just using different data. So we work with human subjects. We do all kinds of different database design projects like registries, clinical trials. Some of them are multi-site where you're sites. We do have electronic data management systems that we use, and Dr. Luming also mentioned that some of you doing that. So some of the things I'm going to talk about may or may relevant, but I'll sort of tailor that to what you guys would like to talk about in that area. And then most of the people that we work with are affiliated with the medical school. We do some projects. The School of Nursing, the Dental School, and the School of Public Health. I don't have a lot of experience with data management expertise or area things that the School of Education is working on. So I did want to ask you a little bit to tell me a little bit about what you do and what kinds of data management processes you might use. So for example, do you collect data on paper forms? Do you collect it in Excel spreadsheets? Do you database? How do you collect your data? All the above, none of the above. Paper, most people have paper. Yeah, Qualtrics. Okay. And then, okay, so some database, some in Excel spreadsheets. All right, so I think we can work from that because I think really the things I'm going to talk about are very basic common sense. Being aware to think about managing your data. So when I first came here, I really didn't know what to think of the university because at Pfizer, there's like a whole team of people that do data management. It's all clinical trials. It's very regimented. We have standard operating procedures for everything we do. It's all very right. And when I came here, I would talk to different people about data management, and I would get these really different ideas of what it was. So before I ever talk to anybody about data management, I like to sort of come to a common understanding of what we say or what we mean when we say data management. So I think of data management as a process, and it's really about identifying, collecting, storing, reviewing, and delivering data, and doing it in a way that will ensure that it's good quality. And the way to make it of good quality and to be reliable is to actually use consistent processes for managing the data and to document what those are, and to think about ways in which you can set things up so that you're reducing errors and also taking into consideration what the people on your team need to do with the data and come up with an idea of what you want to collect. But if the person that's filling out the form has a different work process than how you lay things out on the form, it's not necessarily going to work. Or if you think you're going to collect certain data and you haven't talked to the statistician, they may say, well, I need different data than what you put on that form. That's not going to get me what. So I like to think of it as a shared activity that different members of your team really need to give input so that you're on the same team. We tend to think of it as a team that consists of an investigator. That's the one that's actually driving the research and is going to give you the clinical, scientific interpretation of what you're doing. Statistician is at the end thinking about how we're going to analyze the data, what kind of reports do I need to generate, and trying to think about what data do I need to have, in what format does it need to be in for me to do my work. Study coordinator might be the person that's actually collecting the data, consenting the patient. And so for them, some of the things you might decide to do with the data are not practical in their day-to-day life of working with people and having to fill out those. We talk about study developers as someone that might build the database for you, and then data managers are the people that actually the data and come up with a process to make sure that it's being taken care of throughout the life of the study. I know in some cases you may be working on people, you don't have a whole team of people like that. So what I like to suggest is that when you're working with data, and if you are a small group, to just try and put on a different hat every now and then. Think about, okay, from my perspective, as a study coordinator, this makes sense, but I wonder if the statistician has any trouble with what I'm suggesting. Or if you're going to be doing analysis and the data collection, then you have to sort of talk back and forth between those activities and figure out what's going to make sense. So a lot of discussion, we end up having a lot of discussion about the data when we work. And this is just sort of a little schematic that I put together, and it's going to get kind of busy, but it actually is going to go through the whole process because we talked about needing to identify the data. That's the first thing we're going to do. But when I think about identifying the data, I think that's protocol for. How are you going to collect it? You could collect it in paper format or electronic or both. Some people put it on paper and then put it into a database. Other people might put the data right into a database. CRF stands for case report format. Use that terminology, but you'll hear that a lot from me. Then we're going to store it and we're going to figure out, are we going to put it in Excel or are we going to put it in a database with it? And we're going to review it and what we typically call it discrepancies in the data and trying to clean those up. And then the last step you're going to do is transfer the data or give it to the person that's going to. So we're going to kind of we are going to walk through this whole process to some degree. And then along the bottom here, I've listed some tools that we use, processes that we use to actually build in data integrity. So the work is actually, the data is moving through this cycle, but we're actually coming up with documentation along the way to make sure we manage each of those pieces in a consistent. So how do we identify the data? The protocol is the main thing that you need to use to figure out what data you need to collect. And then another thing that you might do for data management is to come up with an overall data management, sort of like the parallel to the protocol, where you're going to lay out who's responsible for what and how you're going to manage the data throughout the life of the project. Do you get study protocols that are fairly well written, or do you get grant proposals, or do you get verbal suggestions or told what to do verbally about what data to collect? I think in our group we struggle a lot with not everybody gives us the details we need to really work. And so we really try and encourage people to use a standard protocol template so that there's kind of brought it into giving you the information you need to actually know what data it is that you need to collect. Have you seen schedule of events and protocols that you look? Sometimes, not often. So one thing that I would say is if you don't get a good protocol, what we usually do is sort of map out the data. So, oops, in the wrong button for the pointer, sorry. So this is basically, this is sort of like a diagram of all the data collection for a protocol summarized in a table. So you can, if you look across the top, it tells you the name of the visits. There's a screening visit and then different assessments done at different days, and then a final follow-up visit 14 days after the initial visit plus or minus 2 days. And then along down the side, it says what they're going to do on each of those days. So, for example, they're going to do a physical exam at the screening visit and then at the end of the study. So even if I didn't have a full protocol, I could sort of map out or work with someone to say, tell me what you're going to do at each time point and come up with a grid like this, at least then you have something that you can sort of generate a conversation. So, for example, okay, you said vital signs, but what does that mean? Is it blood pressure? Is it temperature? Is it pulse? What are the parameters that you need? So if you get something like this built, it sort of provides a shell and a way for you to have a conversation about what it is. I did mention the data management plan. That sort of is getting built as you're working on the project because you won't necessarily know all the details of what you're going to do with the data until you start working on it. So, for example, who's going to be responsible for making the case report forms? You're going to have a database. Who's responsible for building it? You need to send out reports to your funding organization. When do you have to do those, and who's going to be responsible for doing that? So what it does is sort of lays out the plan so that, and I like to think about it sort of as if you left tomorrow and someone has to take over your project, you go to that document and figure out what it is that they needed to do to take care of the data in the way that you guys as a group had decided to manage it. So here's just sort of a list of some of the things that you might see in a data management. Who's going to enter the data? You create paper case report forms. There might be a process for reviewing and approving those. If you randomize a clinical trial, you might have to write up what's the process and who's responsible for making sure that happens. There's a number of things that you can add, and then what we typically do is circulate to the whole team that information so that everybody's on the same page. This is the timeline. If you don't agree, let me know and we'll update it so that we're all on the same page. So we talked a little bit about the protocol and the data management plan. So after we identify the data, we want to think about how will we collect it. So as I said before, you could do paper or you could do electronic, or you could do start on paper and then transfer it system. And along with that, there are processes that you can do to make sure that when you fill out the forms, it's done well. Data from put it into. So here's some best practices about collecting data. These are things to think about if you're building. You always want to make sure that you have identifiers to be able to track patients. And at what time time points you're collecting that data. We typically try to use unique identifiers that don't identify the person, so not their birth, not their medical registration number, not their security number, something that will keep their privacy as much as possible. So for example, U of M-001. If you're working with a couple sites, then you might use the U of M to say these are the universities. You have a site in Texas that might be TX-001, so that you can know who you're talking about without really exposing them or, trying to maintain their privacy, basically. The other thing that we find happens a lot is that people get hung up on trying to collect as much data as they possibly can because they might need it sometime. And so they over-collect too much detail, too much information. Either you don't have enough of that detail to do anything with it, or you just make a lot of work for yourself because some people have it, some people don't. You don't really know why you have it, but you still feel compelled to clean it up when you're not really sure what you're doing. So we really try and stick to things, focus on what do I need to do, what do I need to collect to analyze the data, or if I need to run a report for somebody, what are the data that I need? Focus on that, and that's like keeping track of when you called somebody to see if they're going to come in for. You're not going to analyze that. That makes your job easier, but it doesn't necessarily have to be captured on a case report form. So I think it's a really nice idea if you're working with people to kind of question them if you feel like they're asking for you to collect something that you're really not seeing in the protocol as being important, or it's not even mentioned in the protocol, to kind of push back and say, why do you need that data? Are you going to analyze it? making work for ourselves. The other thing is it's really a good idea to try to eliminate the need to interpret the information. So free text means you can write in whatever you want. So for example, if you had a free text box for what medications are you on, they could type in anything they wanted to. I put in things that you want, like vitamins or herbal stuff, or maybe you do want that, but it's much better to either give them a list or some sort of structure so that you get what you really want out of it and don't have to read everything that somebody says, find out what that data point is. So another example would be, and I can show you on some of the forms, like race. Sometimes there's a category that says other, and you can specify what that other race is. Sometimes people will write in things that really do equate to one of the races that are in the list. So you have to be careful about giving people the opportunity to just write whatever they want, because they do, you're the ones that are going to be having to go through it and make sure there's something of value in there. And then lastly, anticipate the unexpected so that you don't end up with forms that have responses or items where nobody responded. Because so sometimes it's good to have something, a choice of unknown, not done, not applicable, because not everybody will be able to pose the way you expect them to. I think there's always a one-off kind of case, and so you want to give people an out so that they can check the box rather than leave it blank saying it's unknown, I can't pick any of the choices you gave me because they don't fit. So here's an example of a PBIRD case report form that we built, and just to give you a little bit of an example of what I just talked about. So at the top you can see there's some tracking information. What's the ID of the site if it's a multi-site trial? You might have a visit name or baseline that you can put in there, subject's name and the date of the visit. A way to prevent people from leaving things blank is to give them a question like this first one that says, did you collect the vital signs, yes or no? If they say no, then anything underneath that would make sense for it to be. If you didn't have that question, you got a paper form that was completely blank, you wouldn't know if they just didn't do it, what happened, where's that data? And that example actually works even better in electronic systems. If you say, did you collect the vital signs, and you say no, electronic systems will ask all those questions so that there's no opportunity for it.
All right, is this slide can be posted?
Yeah, well, I can send it them afterwards. Sure. Prevent misinterpretation. So in this example right here, for weight, there's 3 places, a decimal, you can barely see it, there's a decimal place, and then another place after that. So it's very clear that you want weight to the 10th of a pound or kilogram. Plus, we've left no room for misinterpretation because they can put either pounds or kilograms, and if we hadn't put those there, just had a slot where they could put in the weight, could be, say, 106, what am I supposed to do? So you would get all kinds of different, people would make their own decisions about what to put there, but by doing this, they can't interpret it for themselves because you've made it much more clear what it is that you expect. Another example would be on dates. So here it's saying we want 2 numbers here, we want the month spelled out, 3 letters for the month and the full year. So it gives people some prompts about what you expect from them. And then required versus nice to have. An example I would give is for systolic blood pressure or blood pressure in general, you might ask for, was the participant lying down, were they standing, sitting? That's extra data that maybe is useful for some studies, but in most studies it isn't. So if your study is about blood pressure, maybe you do care whether they're sitting or lying down, but if your study is about depression and you're measuring blood pressure from some, you probably don't care whether they're, you don't need to get specific about that piece of data. So those are the kind of questions you might go take back to your team. Do you care if it's lying down? Do you care if it's raising blood pressure, or is it you just want a general number and that's good enough? So the statistician, the clinician would help you if you got into some of that. Or like temperature is another one. Do you care if it's oral, rectal, axillary? Probably not. Most people much in their data collection. I have that extra information that you have to clean up, basically. This is just another example of a case report form. This is actually one that I actually got from somebody. So here's a real good example of what not to do. So any guesses why this is not the best way to handle this? Is it actually one question or two?
It's 2 questions.
Right. So you can't really clean that, plus people can write in whatever. So a better way to handle it would be like this, where you give, these are NIH supported choices. And then again, we gave them instructions. So because some people might be like, primary race, can I put more than one? So we've given them prompts to let them know what's expected. And then again, as I was talking about before, in this case, they check other, we could ask for text. The thing is, if you do that, then usually you have to go back and look at this and go, does this really equate to one of these choices? So your statistician might say, I don't really care about the specify what the other is. I'd rather just know that they're other and be done with it. Don't even bother collecting this because it's just making. So those are the kind of conversations that we find with people to get at what do you really need and why do you need it. And then the other option that we showed here is not reported. Sometimes people. So if we didn't have that there, someone that didn't want to answer what their race was would leave it blank, and then you'd have to go, I wonder why they left races. Whereas if we have this option, your work is done because you already know why they didn't choose a race. So those are some examples of what you can do to improve the quality of your data collection. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about moving from paper to electronic case report forms if you use electronic systems. They have some really nice features, but you have to think about what's best for your study. So for example, if you use paper, you pretty much can do whatever you can figure out how to do. So you can put like a visual analog scale and then have people measure on a number. There may be some systems that can't do that for you. You may be out in the field and going to people's houses and they may not have internet, or you may not want to bring a laptop, or you can't, and so paper makes more sense. But then there's other times when electronic case report forms do make more sense, and a lot of the things that they can offer are really good in terms of helping with the quality of the data, and I've listed some of those. So one of the things is mandatory fields. A lot of systems will, when you set them up, will allow you to say this is a required field. Like it says, a real good example would be most people are going to know their date of birth. It's really an important piece of information. So if you were building a database, you might say, I want this required so that nobody should be skipping their. There's other things that may not be so important that you would leave not mandatory. A lot of systems can tell you if it's an invalid type of data. So for example, if you took somebody's temperature, you would want a whole number. You wouldn't want. Let me say that over. Yep, right. It has to be in the right format so that, and you can improve the quality because it will not allow you to add sort of format that it's not expecting or a type of data it's not. Some systems will let you put range checks on things. So if you have blood pressure, you can say, I want the diastolic or systolic blood pressure to be flag me if it's less than 80 or over 150, and you can shift that depending on the kind of people you're working with. So if you're working on a study where everybody's got really high blood pressure, you might shift that range from what's normal to what's normal for that population, and then let it flag only those things that fall way outside of that, because if you make it too narrow of a range, you're going to get dinged all the time to check it. So wider the range, the less problems you have, the less precise information is that you have. Being as tightly as you might, but if you make it narrower, then you can be more precise about that piece of data. And so you sort of have to weigh how important is this information. Do I want to be checking it, or is it really not that important? I only want to know those things that seem completely out of whack to have, like a systolic blood pressure of 300. So you might, depending on what the value is of that data, you can make that range narrower or wider to suit you. And that, again, is something that you could discuss with your team, to ask them how important that data is before you set those sorts of. Skip logic is something else, a data management system. So I gave that example. Hey, did you complete this assessment? And you say no, it hides or skips those other things so that prevent people from inadvertently. And then sometimes the systems allow you to do calculations. It's always better to have something programmed rather than. So, say, for example, build a calculation that will actually populate it for you versus you yourself, and then, gosh, I hope I did that right. Maybe we should check it, and then I got to put it in the database. Did I make a transcription error when I put it in there? So there's lots of ways that using an electronic. Let's see. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the things you can do after you've built your case report forms, which are CRF completion guidelines, which apply to the paper part of the process, or data entry guidelines, which is you get the data from. So an example of a CRF completion guideline would be instructing, this is on the bottom, this is actually like from a concomitant medication form. And so it asks for the name of the medication, the dose and frequency, reason why you're using it, and when you started it. Well, a lot of people don't know that. And so rather than leaving this blank or having a question like, I don't know how to, don't have the exact date, you can write a guideline that says, if you don't know the date, to enter you in, so that everybody does it the same way. And that's why it's there. And then moving from, if you visualize moving from a paper case report form system, then you do the same thing, because sometimes what you have on paper makes sense on paper, but it doesn't necessarily. And this is often a good thing to do if you have somebody that's entering the data that's really not familiar with research or doesn't have a science background. So it could be things as simple as, someone on the form put this for primary, and the person that's entering the data needs, it doesn't accept that, so they need to type out primary. Things like that. So you can make sort of a set of rules. It's the same idea. It's just documenting how do you deal with problems in the data that you didn't. Both of those things that I just described are really balanced. Any questions on any of that? So the next thing we wanted to talk about, we figured out how we're going to collect the data. Now we're going to figure out how to store the data. I know sometimes it's Excel, so forgive me if I talk a little bit more about data design, and I'll try to maybe keep it a little light. And I think I already did explain a lot. And the other thing that we do is have a process to help validate as well. So you really need to think about who can see the data, how am I going to find it, how do I know that it hasn't changed. So even if you don't use an electronic system, just be thinking about those things anyways, like how do I keep it from, how do I know it hasn't protect with a password, what can I do to make sure that my data are secure. Some of the nice things about electronic data management systems or electronic data capture systems is usually they have differentiated user roles and privileges. So some people can write and add data, some people can look at the data. Your own data, you can't see the site. Usually you have to, it requires that you have a password and user authentication to make sure that the person that should really be in there. Some systems will allow you to sign forms electronically. They usually include encryption procedures and have audit trails so that you can keep track of what happened to the data if we changed it. And now a lot of times it also asks. So if you're functioning as a data manager and someone's building a database, you may be the person most likely to help figure out, after reading the protocol, what type of data should we expect, what's the format going to look like, is it going to be whole numbers, is it going to be a fraction, help whoever might be working with you in a way that makes sense for you. We talked about some of the restrictions or expectations you might have for the data. So if someone's building it, you could say, I need a range for blood pressure. This is the range my team agreed on. So when you build a database, build that range into it. And then again, the mandatory fields. What are the pieces of data that we absolutely should have and we are most likely to get? Because you can make something mandatory, but if it's not be practical, because you're not always, say 50% of the time people don't have that information. It might not be worth making it mandatory because 50% of the time they have. Those are the kinds of things that you could help as a team go with your team, figure out if you're trying to build a database. I'm not sure I really want to get into this too much, but it's just sort of trying to illustrate how this is a paper form and sort of what we're talking about when we say we build it in a database, the database specifications. So, for example, heart rate that's the name that's going to be in the database. The type of data that's going to be part of my wrap here, but it's going to be a number. Is the type of data it's going to be? It's going to be an integer, and we're going to restrict it to be a number for heart rate between 50 and 100. And in this case, we're not going to make it mandatory because someone says, was it collected? And they say, no, we don't want it required that they fill this part out. So that's sort of a way of sort of looking at how you translate you see on a paper form to what it might look just like to someone that's actually working on building it. So if you build a database, what we like to do is test it before we actually use it. Way to help building quality. In the example I have here, this is a REDCap database data entry screen, and this is a vital signs screen. And you just think about what is a mistake someone might make. So in this example, temperature really should have been put on in this line right here, but they made a data entry error and they put it a line up. So that could really happen. And I'm testing to make sure that data that I don't want in there actually flags. So it's telling me the respiration rate is not an integer. So it's the wrong type of data and it's flagging these. So when you test a database, good idea to put in data that you think are like false positive and false negative. So you want to put in data that shouldn't flag and make sure it doesn't. Versus you want to put in data that should flag and do that with all the different pieces that you have to make sure they're all working the way you expect. And the other thing that happens, even if it's working the way you expect, is sometimes just the process of trying to figure out your workflow and how it's really going to cover, oh gosh, this isn't going to work in the clinic the way we have it set up. I'm not going to, doing the data entry in there. Putting the data in this order, or that's going to take too long, or you might see something funky about the way you have it set up that you don't know if you hadn't tracked it before you started using it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to review the data. This is often called discrepancy management, and it's really talking about discrepancies between the elements, but you can also look at it within univariate check. So like way to check the data is if it's mandatory, it's left blank, that's technically a data discrepancy. So it's not always between two data items. Sometimes it's going through and saying, well, these are the things that are mandatory and some of them are missing. So need to. That makes sense. And so some of the things that I like to think about when you're reviewing the data, this is something that comes up quite a bit that people don't think about, is we always ask that people include a form that says what the status is of the trial. Your protocol usually talks about what you need to be eligible, you fail the screening process, what does that, how do you fail the screening process, how is that defined? If you terminate early before the study's over, what does that look like? And what does it mean to have completed the study? Does it mean it's a drug study that you took all the drug, or does it mean you took all the drug and you finished the 30-day follow-up? What does completed mean? Those things are clearly understood by everybody, because what we use this for is a couple things. One of the things is if you're trying to track what data is missing. If someone dropped out halfway through your study, it makes sense that the data is missing. You want to know that in an easy way. So if you have a way to keep track of who's really in the study, who's not, who dropped out, who screen failed, that's going to save you from trying to figure out why stuff is missing when it makes total sense that it is. The other thing that happens is it's nice to know, often people want to know why someone's failed their screening procedures or why they dropped out early, because if you see a trend in that information, it may cause you to revise the protocol. Your screen failure. Maybe there's something in the way the protocol is written that people are dropping out because may amend the protocol to do a better job of keeping people in the study. So it helps with study management, but it also helps with data management. The things that I like to think about in terms of how do I take care of the data and what do I review? First of all, I want to make sure, like I said, that there aren't any missing cases. You have to know that you have all the data that you need to look at before you start looking, or at least, you know what I mean, to be aware that what do you have and what you don't have, because you might be trying to clean something that you're not supposed to have. And then once you have kind of gone through that exercise, look at what data are missing on any of the forms. That's a good thing to do. Look for things that are in the wrong format. Look for things that are out of normal or expected range. And then look for things that are illogical in terms of the relationship with the elements. So for a really kind of cheesy example that I always give is, someone said on their demographics form that they were male, but then 2 weeks later they had a pregnancy test result. Those data alone are fine, but if you look at them together, they make no. So that's a kind of, like I said, easy example. What I mean about looking for illogical relationships between things. And then, as I mentioned before, if you have free text fields, those can be problematic because reading and deciphering and interpreting doing any further. And then biggest thing that I learned when I first came to the university is a lot of people don't look at their data throughout the give it to the statistician at the end, and the statistician ends up that quite often. And you can learn so much by doing it on this. First of all, it's more efficient, it's easier, less stressful than doing it. And you can learn so much along the way about the project that really helps that you know. So for example, you might find that one site's always screwing up one form. Well, maybe they didn't when you ask them to do that. So it might be a teaching moment where you go back to that site and say, hey, the reason your data is looking like this is because I think you're not doing the procedure the way we expected you to do it. Let's talk about that. Maybe we need to form, maybe we need to change the protocol. What's the problem? Yeah, or like people that are, if you have a multi-site trial, sometimes the site might not be performing as well. They're not even entering, they're way behind. So that might be. Or there are things that you didn't realize about the protocol that require you to go the way the data are looking. Step on unless you get. So one of the ways that you can document how you're checking data is what we call a validation checklist, and this may be very, yes, so I'm going to show it to you, but you may have to later version of do it. But basically what we do is create a spreadsheet that lists every form by number and name, and then says what it is that we're going to check on a regular basis and what we're going to do if we find there's a problem. So this kind of pertains more to like a multi-site trial where data manager querying other sites when she sees a her sheet or problem with the data. And then keeping track of when you change what you're doing. So for example, maybe halfway through the trial, you'll realize, oh, we should be checking something on. You can add that as like sort of a side note, change management sort of thing, to say on this date, we started checking this particular. People might want to know that. You might want to go back for that date and see how much data is affected. It's really helpful to keep track of when you started checking things, or maybe you stopped checking things because it really wasn't worth the time that you were putting into it and really had any objections to you doing that. So there's different ways to do that, but I think the main point is it's really important to document what you're doing so that everybody knows. That's good for you because you can tell your boss is checking it, and I share that with them so they can say, oh, that's a great idea, or no, I'm checking that, here's something else better. And then again, if someone else needs to follow up afterwards, they can start doing that if you're not there. So I'm really big on documentation. Difficult, it's just a different way of thinking about your work, I guess. So some of the things you can do for illogical relationships, and that, forgive me, these drug studies, for example. Participant is obese, say on a form they said there was something that checked obese, but yet their BMI comes out normal on another place that you have information, or their reading level is 10 times higher than age appropriate. I mean, you know what I mean? It's just a way of sort of saying this is way off from what I expected. And then other things that you want to look for are things that are about your protocol that are unexpected or might be an unsafe or unacceptable result. So for example, an assessment was done prior to the date of consent, a visit date occurred outside the visit window, or inclusion criteria were not met, but a study intervention. They're classic things that you can check. Another thing you can do is if you don't have program checks, you can pull the data out and look at it in this. And so some systems that we use have ways of programming. But if you can't program, the other thing, the slide is just trying to get to the point that sometimes it takes a human being some sort of judgment call on if there's an error or not. So for in this example, this is data that was pulled out of the database. And anytime you see a 1, that means yes. So yes, this person is on an ACE inhibitor. Yes, beta blocker. No, a calcium channel blocker. And then here it says if you say other, specify. So in other words, they said yes, it's something other than these. And what is it? It's this drug right here. Well, if this is a cardiac study and you look at all the people that said it was something other than the ones that were offered as choices on the form, they all make sense except for penicillin doesn't. Cardiac drug that's really. So if you program checks, they're not going to figure out things like that. So in some cases, even if you are able to use programming to look for data discrepancies, still can be value in annually and looking through what the data really say based on your knowledge. And then the other thing that's really can be helpful is to generate reports about your data. So a lot of times people will look at how many people are enrolled, if they're in follow-up or off studies, the way to report study is progressing in the time frame that you're using it to. And the other thing you can do sometimes is summarize the data and look at that. So in the example I have here about adverse events, you can see that most of them are fairly low in number except for headaches. So, so if someone takes a look at this, they may question why drug or whatever you're doing that's giving people headaches. Database is set up, it could be anything. You don't really know until you go and investigate. So reports are another way to take a look at your. And then lastly, we can talk about how you prepare your data to transfer it or give it. And what the best practice is that is called locking and freezing the database. And basically, it's a methodical way of making sure that you've taken care of all the data so that you can be confident that when you give it to someone to analyze, you don't have to clean it anymore. Everything's there. It's all been taken care of. It's all nice and tidy for that person to look at and be confident that what they have is data. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you have all the data that you thought you're going to get. So that goes back to forms. Do you know why they're missing? Or data out there that you still haven't gotten yet. Once you have all the data, then you want to go through that process of looking for data discrepancies, going through that list of ways you're going to check the data and do it one time. Then if you're using a database or even if you have paper forms, you want to some way communicate, we're not collecting any more data, we're done. Don't change anything anymore unless I know you're doing it because I'm trying to get to this at the point of being done so we can give it to someone else. And every time somebody touches something, we got to go back to the beginning and start over again with cleaning and make sure it's in the right order for everyone that needs to use it. And then usually what we do is give that preliminary data set to the person that's going to analyze it, let them look at it, and sometimes they may see something that we didn't see. We have to go back and clean the data and that kind of that whole cycle again. And then essentially once that's completed and it's looking good, then you give it to the person that actually wants to do the data analysis. And then you can go through a process archiving the data in your document. And then just some things to think about if you have data, there are restrictions and regulations that data. So who owns the data? Do you have permission to share it? Where you can store it long term? How long do you have to save it? These are all things that you need to think about before the study ends, but certainly have it ready when you're done because you aren't really done until those things figured out. I did go to the IRB for health sciences and behavioral sciences. An expert on data security and those sorts of things. So I just put this up here as a reference, and I'll send the slides afterwards in case you want to look at it. But there's some good information in here about what the investigators' responsibilities are, and some links to things like this about through IT services. I don't know if you guys use this at all. Have you seen this webpage? There's a lot of really good information on here about how to manage kinds of data. Certain systems are allowed to hold. Gives you, and there's other things about what kind of tools that they're making, sharing data, transferring data, storage of data. There's just a ton of information out there. So as I said, I'm not going to go into any detail, but just to let you know, if you want to take a look at when I send the slides, it might be a good place if you have some questions. Record retention, I tried. This is an old slide. I couldn't find an updated one, but there are lots of rules around how come up with what you want to do when you're done. It really depends on the type of data and who's regulating it. So I would suggest looking for information about that as well if you're getting to the records. And then I just put some additional resources at the end for you about data sharing and security. This reference here, Practical Guide to Clinical Data Management, is a really, really good book. I've given it to everybody that works in our group. It talks about basically everything I talked about, and it's very user-friendly, really easy to read. And to be honest, I mean, I was a medical technologist. I never did data management, and it's not that hard to grasp. You don't need special training for it. It's just learning how to do it, and I just happen to have a passion. So I think if you are interested, that's a really good start to get more information about what data management is about. And then Mishar has a lot of interesting stuff on our website. That's all I have for you today. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I appreciate you coming in at the end of the day. That's always
You talked about identifying the mismatch. Which one, when you have a case where it's basically there's male,
right, which is the right
one.
So usually what happens, and usually that sort of work multi-site trials. And so what you end up doing is sending like a query to them, which in the olden days it used to be a paper form. Says you said this person's male and they have a pregnancy test. Please clarify. You'd send it to the site. They go look at their source documents. Go, oh, made a mistake. It's really a female. And they write back and say change it to female. Send it to the data manager. The data manager goes, changes the data and files the form as documentation that you got approval from the site to actually do that. A lot of times there's electronic ways to do that now. So for example, RedCap, you can do that same sort of process without using paper. So it's mostly about documentation. So you have to ask, go to the source to figure out which one is the right answer. Documenting how you came to the decision and making sure that you close the loop. Okay, actually change the data so the next and again, that's something if you have a data management plan and you don't necessarily full-blown discrepancy management, send out forms kind of thing, you can write for yourself how you're going to manage that. So are you going to email from so-and-so and you're going to file it in this folder and they're going to change it and you're going to go in behind them and check that they really did it, or are you going to do it? You just have to come up with a way to manage it that makes like that's half the battle is getting it and getting people to buy into it. So we have a lot of standard operating procedures. So the database, statistician to read specifications and make the principal investigator and the statistician sign off saying they approve of what we do. So we have documentation that what we agreed to, change it, please know that we started from a place where we were all on the same. Paper case report development is another example of this is what we agreed to, you signed off on it, so if you want to change it, that's fine, but please know that we already talked about this. Again, it's a lot about process and documentation. Having the passion to do it, I guess, or the mindset to do it. Not everybody likes to do it. Anything else? Thank you very much.
We'll just have
Yes. I know we have. Oh, okay, yeah. All that I can use them, that's someone else.